And now we bring you Killer Wives, Episode 3, Sunday School Teacher. These are the actual case facts of Marilyn K. Plants, who solicited a murder for hire against her own husband. Isn't trust a bitch?
Where's your emergency?
As Mrs. Plants prepares her Sunday school lesson, the fire department is assisting the police in closing in on her husband's killers. On the early morning hours of August the 26th, 1988, emergency services are dispatched to the charred remains inside of a small truck. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Killer Wives, a show that reveals how ladies love their husbands to death. In this week's episode, The Sunday School Teacher, we bring you the story of Marilyn K. Plants, a woman who plotted a savage murder for hire against her husband, Mr. Jim Plants, father of her 3 children and husband of 11 years. With this case, I'm reminded of a famous biblical quote that states, "For the love of money is the root of all evil." On August 26, 1988, at approximately 4 a.m. in the morning, that evil would show its ugly face. A one Mr. Jim Plants, a 17-year employee of the Daily Oklahoma newspaper, left his job at the end of his shift, as he usually did. On his way home, he made one stop at the all-night market to buy groceries for his now sleeping family. This would have been in keeping with his character, as he was said to be a man who took care of his family and was always attentive to his children. Some would say a care that had no bounds. In fact, at Marilyn's behest, a few months earlier, he increased his $30,000 life insurance policy to one worth 10 times that much, or $300,000. He wanted to secure their future if he were no longer around to help them. His wife Marilyn was the sole beneficiary of that insurance policy. But who wouldn't trust their own wife, who not only held a job part-time, but a Sunday school teacher as well? But what Mr. Plants did not know beyond her being a Sunday school teacher was that she was having an ongoing affair with a young black man, 17 years his junior, while he was away each night at work. A man by the name of William Clifford Bryson, a young man that she had manipulated and groomed 3 months with the purchasing of clothing and alcohol to this minor. Those who knew her habits beyond her husband said she had a double life, and that she would put her children down at night to sneak out and party with the younger crowd. To fund that newfound freedom and love affair, Mrs. Plants began to see Mr. Plants as now being worth more dead to her than alive. And she was just about to cash in on that policy. That faith-filled night, Jim drove those same tree-lined streets he usually did, night after night uneventfully. He arrived home and parked his favorite white Nissan truck, similar to this one in the picture, to make a model, at the front of the family house. After gathering the groceries in his arms, he walked up to the front porch of his country home. What Jim never expected or knew was that there were two men awaiting him in his now darkened house. But let us go back now to the original forming of his wife's adulterous affair and the plotting of this murder mystery. William Clifford Bryson, the lover of Mrs. Plants, had met him in the spring of 1988. The two began an ongoing personal relationship and had previously attempted to have Mr. Plants killed. Marilyn Plants had indicated to Mr. Bryson, who she by the time had a sexual relationship with, that her husband was abusive to her, and she wanted to get rid of him and collect on his life insurance policy. What this very young and naive man didn't know was that this was a lie to get him motivated enough to commit murder. You know, each time we prepare these cases, and I find it hard that one woman can motivate one or two guys to kill another man, where the government of their own country couldn't get these guys to do this in a wartime situation. But back to the case. Miss Plants had approached Mr. Bryson and Mr. Clinton Kimby with a mission to deprive Mr. Plants of his life. Bryson subsequently offered a Mr. Roderick Ferris, another man, $40,000 to kill Mr. Plants. Terry Norman, yet another man, overheard Bryson say he had just talked to Mrs. Plants and that she was upset because her husband had physically assaulted her. When Ferris asked why she didn't just divorce her husband, Bryson answered that she wanted to collect some money. Now, Bryson indicated that if he had to kill Mr. Plants by himself, he was going to have to catch him coming home from work early and ambush him off guard. The plan was to beat him with a baseball bat and set him on fire in his own truck. A week later, Ferris again encountered Bryson and Marilyn at a local grocery store. Bryson offered Ferris $10,000 to kill Mr. Plants. He then introduced Ferris to Mrs. Plants as the one I was telling you about that would kill your husband. Mrs. Plants told Ferris it would have to look like an accident. So later that night, Bryson, Ferris, and McKimble met at the Plants' home, where they ate hamburgers and listened to music while waiting for Mrs. Plants to come home from work. When Ferris thought he heard something at the front door, at that time Mrs. Plants told him that it was her husband, to take him out, kill him. Bryson at that moment picked up a hammer and McKimby a knife, but it was not Mr. Plants. Later still that night, Mr. Ferris arrested and jailed on an unrelated charge. 2 days later, Bryson and McKimble were again with Mrs. Plants. Bryson picked Mrs. Plants up from her work, where she had just quit her job. The murderous trio would use this night in preparation to take a life. Mrs. Plants, not wanting to raise suspicion with her husband, would keep away from the house while waiting for him to go to work at 6 p.m., as he did each night. The trio then drove around the evening, going to a bank where Mrs. Plants withdrew money, and she subsequently spent on cocaine and beer. Arriving at the Plants' home later that evening, Mrs. Plants retired to her bedroom at approximately 10:30 p.m. Bryson and McKimble remained in the living room, drinking beer and smoking cocaine until approximately 11:30 p.m. that night, when the both of them fell asleep mere hours later. But hearing a key in the front door, they hid on opposite ends of the house, each one of them wielding baseball bats supplied by Mrs. Plants from her son's own bedroom. The one bat made of wood and the other one metal. Mrs. Plants, unaware of what faced him outside, entered the house whistling as it was his normal custom, along with carrying bags of groceries in his arms for his waiting family. Bryson used the fact that Mr. Plants was unaware and struck him first, hitting him not to wound, but to kill with the baseball bat. Mr. Plants at that moment cried out for his wife Marilyn, who had decided to wait in her bedroom until he was totally unconscious. Mr. Plants struggled forward after each blow and blow of the bat, but Bryson hit him again and again. With McKimble soon joining in, the men repeatedly struck Jim because, in their own words, he would not stay down. Finally, Mr. Plants crumbles to the floor. As he lay moaning, Bryson and McKimble picked him up and took his body outside to the ground beside his truck. Miss Plants emerged from the house with no remorse whatsoever about what just happened. She handed the keys to Bryson and commented that her husband's head was busted open and that it was not going to look much like an accident. She then instructed the two 18-year-old young black men to burn his body. The two men then placed Mr. Plant's now bleeding, unconscious body in the bed of his own personal truck, and Bryson drove to a deserted location on the route to Mr. Plant's job at the Oklahoman. This was part of the plan, to make it appear as if Mr. Plant's, not the two murderers, did what would soon follow. McKimble followed behind Bryson, who drove Plant's truck in his wife's own personal vehicle. Mr. Plant's unconscious and hemorrhaging now, with his body was moved from the bed of the truck to the driver's side cab of the truck. His body laying slumped over the passenger side, moving quickly now in order to avoid detection and getting caught. McKimble placed a rag in the gas tank and lit it. But he was surprised when it fell to catch fire. Bryson then poured gasoline onto Mr. Plant's body in the cab of the pickup truck. He couldn't have the evidence found. He then lit a match and threw it into the vehicle cab, which quickly caught fire. As the men got in Mrs. Plant's car and drove away, they turned and looked back, and they saw Mr. Plant's raise up. They were shocked. Mr. Plant's was not dead at this point, as the autopsy would prove that he had smoke inhalation in his lungs. But what Bryson and McKimble knew was that he was in no position physically to save his own life after the beating they had just given him. Bryson and McKimble returned to the Plant's home, where Marilyn K. Plants was cleaning up her husband's own blood. Their two children were asleep soundly in the bedroom. They had no idea what went on. McKimble also began to help clean the floor, while his partner in crime, Miss Plants, cleaned the baseball bats that they used to kill her husband. She directed the men to exchange their bloody clothes for clothes belonging to her former spouse. She placed their bloody clothes in a sack and told them to get rid of the sack. The men soon left Marilyn K. Plant's home, throwing that sack of bloody clothes into the North Canadian River, which flows through Oklahoma City. The two men then drove to a convenience store where they purchased sandwiches and drinks with the money from the former Mr. Plant's own trouser pocket. They went to a friend's home, and this is where they get stupid. Michael Kendrick, Bryson and Kimball told Kendrick about killing Mr. Plants. When asked about his two children, Bryson said they were asleep in their rooms at the time of the murder. So first the two idiots told that they had just murdered somebody. Bryson then phoned Mrs. Plants back at the house, asking if she was all right. Kendrick overheard Bryson to say that they must stay close and that Marilyn had purchased a rug to cover up bloodstains. Early on Friday, August the 26th, 1988, James Earl Plants, 33 years, was found dead in his pickup truck on the side of the road leading towards his job. Prosecutors alleged that Plants was beaten with a baseball bat at his Midwest City home and then burned in his pickup at a secluded location. The very following Monday, police arrested the victim's wife, Marilyn K. Plants, 27 years old, on murder charge. Investigators believe that she had paid someone to kill her husband, William Clifford Bryson, of 18 years, and Clinton Eugene Kimball, 18 years, were arrested the very next day. On that Wednesday, Marilyn Plants, William Bryson, and Clinton McKimble were all charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty in this one particular case because it was so heinous. Police stated that collection on 2 life insurance policies on James Plants, which were worth $319,000, was a probable cause behind this murder. Prosecutors stated that McKimble and Bryson were hired by Marilyn Plants to kill her husband, that these two men had ambushed him in his home by Bryson and Clinton McKimble after returning to the Oklahoma City. So after he got home on August 26, 1988, Marilyn Plants was present as the men severely beat James Plants with baseball bats provided by his wife. James Plants was then loaded into his own pickup truck and driven to 6500 block of Northeast 50th Street in Oklahoma, where the truck was set on fire. At approximately 5:15 a.m. that same morning, in the northeast part of Oklahoma City, the descendant's charred body was discovered inside his burnt-out pickup truck. The driver's side door was open. The descendant's body was slumped behind the steering wheel, and his left leg was outside of the pickup. His foot was resting flat on the ground where he had tried to save himself. He was identified by his dental records, and an autopsy later revealed that the decedents had died from a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and thermal injuries caused by the fire. On October 20th, prosecutors agreed to let McKimble plead guilty to the murder and be sentenced to life imprisonment. As a part of the agreement, he would testify against Plants and Bryson at a preliminary hearing for Bryson and Plants. Now, Roderick Eugene Ferris, who, remember, he got arrested early before the incident happened, he testified that Plants said the murder would have to look like an accident. He also stated that a few days earlier, Bryson had said his girlfriend, being Marilyn Plants, had called and was crying because her husband had beaten her, in his own words. In a video testimony, Bryson told police how he and an accomplice beat Mr. Plants. Bryson said, "I didn't have no specific reason why I killed him. All I was thinking while I was beating him was all the time she came up to me with a black eye and crying. I didn't like that," in the videotape deposition he said. Bryson said that he loves Marilyn Plants. He also stated that Marilyn said her husband had threatened to kill himself and her if she divorced him. Now, Plants denied any role in the killing of her husband. She told police that she had a perfect marriage, but the defense attorney argued that Bryson and Plants should have separate trials because the defendants had inconsistent, mutually antagonistic defenses. But the Oklahoma County District Judge Charles Owens ruled that they would be tried together, that they should be tried together. Joyce Gilchrist, a chemist for the Oklahoma City Police Department, testified in the trial of Plants and Bryson. Neither Plants nor Bryson testified during the trial. The next day's jurors deliberated for 5 hours before voting in favor of the death penalty sentence for both Marilyn Plants and William Bryson. They were each also sentenced to 100 years for recruiting others to help in the murder, 10 years for conspiracy to murder, and a 15-year sentence for burning the pickup truck. Trina Plants Wells, 21 years of age, who was the eldest daughter of Marilyn and Jim Plants. Now, she didn't live in the home with them. She planned for the board to spare her mother's life. Wells was reported as having cried throughout the entire hearing. She recently reconciled with her mother after having had no contact with her for 13 years. In a videotaped statement, Wells said, "My father's gone, and we need a mom. Whether or not she is in prison, we need to have a relationship with her. I really don't want my mom to die. That is my hope. I've had for 13 years to think about it. I love my father. He was my hero, but it is not fair to me to have to go through another funeral and a devastating loss like this." Karen Lowry, the sister of Jim Plants, asked the board to let the execution take place. She stated that Marilyn did not show remorse during the preliminary hearing or the trial. She also stated that she believed the death penalty can deter criminals. In a barely audible voice, Plants apologized to the families, mentioning each sibling, parent, and child by name. "It's hard to think about living the rest of my life in prison. But now I have a reason to live," she said. "I want to live for my daughter, and hopefully for my son." Marilyn Plants was sentenced to death for the 1988 murder of her husband, James Plants. In June of 2000, William Clifford Bryson, 29 years, was executed by injection for his part in the murder. 13 relatives and friends of Jim Plants, including his 2 sisters, father and brother, were at the prison for execution. After a tour of the penitentiary, Karen Lowry, Jim's sister, said Bryson's death does not mean a victory for her family. "It is a no-win situation. Nobody is going to win in the end." Lowry said Sharon Cotton, Jim's other sister, said before the execution that his death would only provide partial closure for the family. Marilyn Plants and Clifford Bryson have lived almost 12 years since Jim was murdered. "That is 12 years longer than my brother lived," she said. She said executing Bryson will provide her family the justice they have sought since the killing. He didn't think twice about taking my brother's life, she said. He didn't think twice about the children of my brother's family and how that would affect us for the rest of our lives. Now, as the case closes, even his wife was executed by lethal injection as one of the last women in that state to be executed that particular year. For the MNN, this is Charles Rivers. Join us next week when we bring you another case of killer wives.